Thank you so much for coming to our research results of rules reform. Today we have three speakers, myself, and then Michael will be speaking about the inefficiency and the efficiency of committees. He's done some great research to show how different committees are more efficient and not. And we have Rachel, who will bring up in the room where nothing happens. So more examples of what happens because of legislative rules in our legislature. Mine is about no one was in the room where it happened. I really was thinking about starting out the presentation with Hamilton's In the Room Where It Happens, because I love Hamilton and I love that song, but the walls are a little thin here, so I thought that we would do that. But so I'm going to be giving you a specific example of Senate Bill 522. You've heard it mentioned several times now, and that was the universal lead testing for children bill. We're going to walk through where it started from and how it ended, and then I'm going to give a couple more examples of rules that sound good, like in, I don't know whether the gentleman is here, about discharge petitions here in Pennsylvania, as well as two other legislative rules in the General Assembly on the floor that sounds good, but they get to manipulate it and bend the rules a little bit. So why are we even talking about this? And that is because Pennsylvania children being tested, and there aren't that many being tested, but they test, the percentage testing with high lead levels is the third in the nation. And so it is a problem. And it just doesn't come from like Flint, where it was coming in the public water system, but most of it here in Pennsylvania is coming from service lines of water into your house, and plumbing in your house and solder in your house, where lead is contributing to the lead in the children's blood, as well as paint. So the banning of paint occurred in 1978. It did start to slow down before then, and lead pipes were outlawed in 1986, but we rank 5th in the nation for homes built before 1950. So there's a lot of homes, apartments, daycare centers, schools. And speaking of schools, the Pennsylvania school building age, the average age is 1964. I think my mic is on, yeah. We got some competition over here with the microphone over there. So you send your kids to school and they may have lead pipes, they may have lead paint, and in fact, when testing was done, 71% were found to have lead in the drinking water. 50% had reported lead in either dust or in paint. And very few of those have actually remediated those issues and abated the problem. Between 2019 and 2020, the percent of children tested by our state health department actually decreased, because it is not universal, it is not all, and that's why it was important to have a change in the law. And that in the last 5 years, there have been 4 bills that were introduced for universal lead testing for children and pregnant women, but all of them failed. So in 2018, the Senate passed a resolution and said, hey, Joint State Government Commission, we want you to form a task force and we want you to assess all of the sources of lead and how much of a problem it is. They had a big task force. It was released, the report was released in April of 2019. Very thorough, studied other states as well, and the laws that other states have. They had significant findings at the end and actually had 10 legislative recommendations. 8 of those 10 actually provided the language that would go into the bill. As Carol had said earlier, cut and paste. And so we have 10. I mentioned Senator Lisa Baker right now because she was on that task force. She is also chair of the Senate House Committee, so that's where this bill would first go to. And she is the sponsor of this bill that came through this session, Senate Bill 522, and it's called Universal Lead Testing for Children. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are the 10 recommendations, and what I can tell you is there was an attempt at only one. And again, these recommendations have been out since April 2019. So the bill, the title of the bill includes, or in the memorandum, our bill seeks to ensure that all pregnant women and all children in Pennsylvania receive blood tests to detect lead poisoning. And as Tony went through before, here's how a bill goes through. So I'm going to run through this real quick and then give you some specific dates. So it goes into committee where it can be amended or ignored or reported out unamended. Once it's out in the Senate, it must go to first consideration. There's 3 considerations when a bill comes out of committee in both the Senate and in the House, and it has to be on 3 separate days. So it goes to first consideration. There is no debate. There is no amending. Then it goes to, if they vote to bring it out to second consideration, it can be amended. And after second consideration, it goes to appropriations, which provides a fiscal note. How much is this going to cost the government, or how much more money will the government have as a result of this bill? This is every bill. And after it comes out of that, it can go to third consideration. It can be amended and then vote for final passage. So here are the dates. We have 14 months that it went through the Senate. Third consideration, it was actually amended to weaken it a little bit. The original bill had children below the age of 24 months would get tested twice. Now the test I'm talking about is a finger prick. It was for all pregnant women, and then it was the medical person has to evaluate the risk of lead poisoning. So this medical professional has to decide, so what age is their building? Was there abatement of lead in that building? There were so many things that would be very difficult for a healthcare provider to be able to determine whether the pregnant woman was at risk. So those two it was passed out on party lines, 33-16, but it did have final passage, which was unanimous, because people were going, well, this is better than nothing. So then it goes over to the House, very similar with the going into committee and coming back out, having first consideration, and actually in first consideration, it actually gets put on the table and off the active calendar, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Second consideration gets referred to appropriations and then reported out. If the House amends the bill, it has to go back to the Senate for the Senate to agree to that amendment or not. So my next slide is going to go through just steps 1 through 3, because starting with step 4, it gets very exciting. So now we got another 4 months. Now we've had 18 months for this bill to make it through. Slow and steady. One amendment that did weaken it some, but it's still fairly close to what was asked for, because the amendment says now a child has to be tested at least 1 time. And it goes to appropriations. And what happens in appropriations? Well, I have to switch up dates and give you hours, because all of this happened on October 26th. And if you remember October 26th, that was really the last day for the Senate. They had November 15th, but they really didn't take up any bills on that day. So this is the bill. It said to require the testing of all children in the Commonwealth. And the Appropriations Committee amends it to say encourage. It said that we should have at least 1 blood level test by the age of 24. They changed that to be the healthcare provider for the child has to consider what is the exposure to lead. So again, they have to know what school did they go to, what's the age of the school, has the school tested for this stuff. So it greatly weakened the bill. And we're pretty much approaching to whatever our law is now for testing. And And it was always that the parents could opt out of this testing. Now what they changed it to is the parents have to opt in. They actually have to give written consent before a blood test can be done. And there's also a requirement, and has always been a requirement, that if that is tests high, there can be some lead contamination on the finger. So then you go to a blood test by drawing blood from the vein. So if the child gets consent from the parents to have the blood test is high, the healthcare provider has to get another consent in order to test it again more thoroughly. Now, the House Appropriations Committee in the rule is supposed to consider the fiscal aspects of the bill and shall not consider the substantive merits of the bill. What I can tell you is that they have to do an actual physical note, and they did one as the bill came into them, and they did another one when the bill was amended by them and came out. It says exactly the same thing. So there was no change to the fiscal aspects, yet they amended it. And this is essentially because in the House, at this point, it only comes out to third consideration, and the House rule says you can't amend on third consideration. So this is essentially their way of amending on third consideration very quickly. So now I'm going to put you in the, hopefully, put you in the room where it happened with the sound. This is October 28th or 26th. This is in the Appropriations Committee. It lists at the bottom there the 10 bills that was advertised that was to be discussed and voted on in committee that day, and it doesn't mention Senate Bill 522. So I'm going to see if this works. This is about a minute long, so it's not going to be too long.
Next, we move to Senate Bill 522. I have a motion by Representative Schmidt, seconded by Representative Fritz to consider the bill. At this time, I have an amendment to the bill that reads as follows. It's Amendment A05860. It amends the provisions regarding childhood lead testing to direct healthcare providers to consider a child's potential for lead exposure and to perform lead testing based on the guidance of the CDC and the Academy of Pediatricians. It also requires parental consent for childhood lead testing. This amendment has been negotiated within the Senate, is agreed to by the prime sponsor as well, and I encourage a yes vote. I have a motion by Representative O'Neill, second by Representative Heffley to approve the amendment. On the amendment? All Democrats will be no on the amendment. All Republicans will be yes.
That was it. Doesn't mention encourage, doesn't give a lot of detail, but obviously it was available enough to the Democrats in that Appropriations Committee to understand how it weakened the bill. That was at 1 o'clock. 3 hours later, it comes to the House floor. And it's an interesting vote of 193 yeas to 6 nays. So I'm going to let you in the room where it happened. And when the chief clerk is called to read the title and a brief description of the bill, it takes him less than 4 seconds. He doesn't mention that it was amended just 3 hours ago and that it was greatly weakened. I will also mention to you that in the rules, it says that when a bill is amended in committee, that amendment must be available to the public for at least 12 hours. But there is one temporary rule left. They took out other ones, but there is one left, and that temporary rule changes it to 3 hours. Oh, 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. That's pretty good.
Speaker recognizes the Majority Leader, who calls up Senate Bill 522, printers number 2009 on page 1 of today's Supplemental A House calendar. Will the House agree to the bill? Agreed to. The clerk will read the title and a brief description of the bill.
This bill provides for lead testing in pregnant women and infants.
This bill has been considered on 3 different days and agreed to. The question is, shall the bill pass Finally, are there any members seeking recognition on the bill? Seeing none, agreeable to the provisions of the Constitution, the yeas and nays will now be taken. Members will proceed to vote.
Have you ever been to an auction? Actually, Speaker Cutler speaks faster than that even. So there you have it. I doubt that most of the 193 that were voting actually knew about the amendment or what the amendment did. It certainly hadn't been available to them for very long. So then we go another hour and 45 minutes, less than 2 hours. Now it's been amended. They've had the vote. It passes. It goes back to the Senate Rules Committee for concurrence on the amendment, and then it goes to the floor of the Senate if the Rules Committee concurs. Now this one you have to really, this is 22 seconds.
I call up Senate Bill 522, sponsored by Senator Baker, which provides lead testing for pregnant women and infants. The bill returns from the House for concurrence and House amendments. Senator Yaw moves the bill. Senator Ahmet seconds. Is there any discussion on the bill? Are there any negative votes? SB 522 is re-reported from committee by a vote of 17-0.
That was it. Now you were in the room where it happened. It goes out to the Senate floor, and Senator Schwank does spend about a minute and a half, 3 minutes talking about what happened to the bill. But it's sitting in front of them. It's their last day. This is better than nothing, I guess. And so they did vote it out at 6:20. So in 5 hours and 20 minutes, this bill changed drastically, and many people, including our representatives and our senators, weren't in the room where it happened. They even had time that day to go ahead and sign it in the Senate and sign it in the House so they could get it to the governor, all in one day. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk to you about the discharge bills. We do have a discharge bill from committee, and it has to be in the committee for at least 15 legislative days. Legislative, not calendar. On average, this last session, 15 legislative days was 30 days, or 3 months, 3 months. So it has to be in there that long. Any member of the House, and these are House rules, can create a discharge resolution. Then it sits on a desk somewhere by the clerk for days that could go by, because it has to collect 25 signatures. And then it's placed on the calendar. Any one of those 25 or more, if there's more signatures, can call it up for a vote or not. Because if you call it up for a vote and it's defeated, then the subject of that bill cannot be in any other bill for the rest of that session. So it is risky. It has to be 102 that vote in favor of it. So I talked about what happens if it doesn't get called up. So what happens to the committee? We've got some days here. The committee knows a discharge petition has been filed for a bill in their committee. So they do a couple of things. They send it out and they re-refer it to another committee. When that happens, and the House Speaker agrees to it, then the 15-day clock starts again. So there's another 3 months. Or they can amend the bill so that it's no longer desirable, or that can actually do a gut and replace, which they did this year with House Bill 717. The bill was to ban assault weapon sales to individuals under 21. Right now it's 18. It changed it from 18 to 21. They probably figured out that they had enough votes in the House in order to get this out of committee. And so what did they do? The chairman, Kaufman, did a gut and replace amendment. They took out all the text and they added in a concealed weapon without permit text, constitutional carry. Now, how that's the same subject, I don't know, because the bill can only be amended so as not to change its original purpose. First consideration, bill comes out in the House, it goes automatically to the table. A really good sounding rule is it can't stay there forever. It has to come out in 15 legislative days. So, example, House Bill 47, what did they do? It was first consideration, it was laid on the table, It came out on the 15th day, and they automatically laid it back on the table. Now, the 15-day clock on the table for first consideration is because it's an automatic tabling of the bill. Now they've manually tabled it, and there is no time limitation. It can stay there till the end of the 2-year session. It's exactly 15 days later. And you can find many instances of this when you do research and you don't have much of a life and you're looking at a lot of bill histories online. And then there's the last good one that I will be speaking on is House Rule 71, the same, 17 or 15 legislative days, that's 3 months. It can't just sit on the House calendar. You have to have action. And if you don't have any action, then it goes back to the committee it came from. So what do? Common practice on that 15th day, for some reason, they could table it and just leave it there, but they want to keep it on the calendar. So they put it on the table and they bring it back off. Same day, same breath. It's in the legislative journal. They're only about this far apart. Here's an example. Those are exactly 15 days that they put it on the table and they brought it off. New 15 days. Put it back on the table, bring it back off. So this is something that they do on a regular basis, and these are the rules that they, to me, are either breaking or they are bending, and I talked more than I should. What's that? We're going to take questions at the end. Well, sorry. And next is Mike to tell us about the efficiency of our committees.
Thank you, Jodi. So yeah, my name is Michael Skros. I've been doing some research over the past couple months. My goal was to determine how different committees in our state house are more efficient than others, what makes them more efficient than others, how they operate. But I think a more appropriate title is committee inefficiency, because there are lots and lots of stories of how these committees essentially get nothing done. So if you're a longtime Fair Districts member, you've probably seen this life cycle of a bill graphic. So this is just an overview of what happens to bills in our 2019-2020 session. But basically the big picture is that most bills that are proposed essentially get thrown in the trash, never considered, never looked at. So more than 70% of bills are never considered in committee. If they make it out of committee, more than half that get passed in one chamber don't get a vote in the other chamber, which means that less than 7% of introduced bills actually make it to the governor's desk. So we want to look at what is actually happening to these bills and why. And the why is that party leaders have an incredible amount of power and can almost single-handedly block any bill. So these leaders, who are, regardless of legislative support or public support, they can block any bill that they don't like. These leaders are the House Committee Chair, the House Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Committee Chair, the Senate Majority Leader, and then the Senate President. So essentially, if any one of these individuals doesn't like a bill for whatever reason, they can just block it, hide it away, no debate, no hearing, nothing. No one's going to talk about that bill. This, as I'm sure you can imagine, is because of legislative rules, rules that we have and rules that we often break or bend, as Jodi just mentioned. So what do our current legislative rules do? They allow one majority party leader who represents roughly less than 0.5% of Pennsylvanians to ignore, block, or as we saw in that example, gut any bill. It doesn't matter how much legislative support is, it doesn't matter if a majority of representatives support the bill, this one individual can block it. They can just throw it in the trash. These committee chairs and party leaders are appointed by their own party, and they can block these bills. They are not chosen by the public. We don't vote on who is going to be the Speaker of the House. They are chosen or appointed by their party leaders or party bosses. And they can gut and rewrite bills to alter their purpose. So what I wanted to see was what is actually happening in some of our committees, kind of dive deep and to see, ideally, if there were certain committees that were performing better than others, if we could use those committees as an example to structure other committees. So just a quick overview is that we have 28 standing House committees and 22 standing Senate committees. As I'm sure you may know, we have 203 House members and 50 Senate members, which means we have a lot of committees. What do these committees accomplish, you might be wondering? Not much. But first, it's important to understand that not all committees are created equal. Some committees can be pretty productive. For example, I found that in this most recent session, the most productive committee was Human Services. So 61% of proposed bills received a committee vote, and over 80% of the bills that were reported out of committee were bipartisan. So you might be wondering, this is a great committee that we should kind of look at in structuring our other committees or creating rules. The only issue is only 16% of those bills ultimately became law. So while it's more efficient than other committees and it has a higher success rate than the overall state legislature, it's still really not ideal. On the other hand, one of our most inefficient committees is the Judiciary Committee. They had 387 bills proposed. Only 66 received a vote in committee. And what I realized as I was doing my research is that some committees do very little or very specific work. So for example, we have a Human Services Committee, we have a Children and Youth Committee, we have an Adult Aging and Older Services Committee. They all deal with similar topics, they're writing similar legislation that kind of lends itself to be more bipartisan. Whereas the Judiciary Committee has a lot more ground to cover in terms of what types of bills they're writing or have to review, and those bills are also more likely to be partisan, for example. So I think one idea that I kind of realized was that it might be better to kind of restructure our committees so that they're more equal in what kind of content they deal with and how often they meet. So some examples of other committees. So we have a Gaming Oversight Committee. Once again, that's like a very specific purpose. They only had 13 bills proposed this last session, and they only voted on one of them, and it did not pass or become law, by the way. On the other hand, the Education Committee had 274 bills proposed, and 11%, only 30 of those bills received a committee vote. So once again, we have lots of committees doing very little, and lots of committees that have almost too much content to possibly get through in one session. And this is often illustrated by how often they actually meet. So the Education Committee met almost 40 times, which you would think, well, they probably got a lot of bills out. That's not true. Whereas other committees, like I mentioned, we have committees to deal with specifically game and fisheries and gaming oversight. These are very specific purposes, and they probably don't need to have their own committee. So, in looking at success stories, I think the prime example is our House Transportation Committee, where almost 40% of proposed bills received a vote. Over 3/4 of bills reported from the committee were bipartisan. 30 of those bills received a vote in both chambers and actually had a chance of becoming law, meaning this is one of the most bipartisan and productive committees in the House. So this sounds really awesome, except for the fact that 2/3 of those bills were literally just naming a single bridge or a highway. And this is where we deal with the issue of we have all these committees that are touting their work in this legislative session, and most of the work is very, very minor tweaks to law, naming a bridge, kind of doing the work of government is the word we've used in our rules group. They're not actually accomplishing or legislating on something that's going to affect Pennsylvanians or improve the lives of Pennsylvanians. They're really just making minor tweaks to existing law or doing things they have to do to keep the government moving. So what can we suggest as best practices to improve the efficiency in our committees? Fair Districts has come up with several examples used in other states just to give ideas of what we can do to kind of empower these committees. So one would be committees must hear all bills. The only downside to this is that, as we saw, there are a lot of bills proposed, so some committees would be working really hard to hear all these bills. Some states actually limit the number of bills a single member can propose, which can limit people just proposing bills because they want to say, look at me, I did something. Other best practices are that bills that are reported from committee must receive a vote on the floor. This would take away that power from the committee chair or the party leader to block any bill they want. This is a super cool one, give a vote to every legislator, meaning that every legislator can pick a priority bill that they like, and that they can introduce this bill. They basically get a guaranteed vote on one of their priority bills. As I just kind of alluded to, other states limit the number of introduced bills per session, so we avoid having all these legislators basically proposing bills that they know don't have a chance of passing. It requires them to prioritize what they're working on. Additionally, proportional representation on committees. So if the one party controls 60% of the House chamber, they should have 60% representation on every committee. And then finally, a chair chosen by vote of chamber rather than appointed by party leaders. So all of these examples, I'm sure there are some flaws in them, some are better than others, but they're just examples of little steps we can take to ensure that we have more efficient committees and that ultimately Harrisburg starts working in a more efficient manner and actually getting stuff done for Pennsylvanians. And with that, I will turn it over to Rachel and then we'll ask questions later. Thank you.
So Jodi showed you a room where things are happening but not according to the rules, and how easy it is to both break the rules and how speedily things may move, the abruptly changed, like the lead bill in the House Appropriations Committee. And it's pretty telling to see our legislators at work. $100,000 a year for that work, I just want to make sure you all know. That's their salary. And Michael showed you about committees. I'm going to show you two quick examples in the real world of bipartisan bills where nothing has happened despite all of the churning. So the first one's carbon monoxide alarms. Many of you may be aware that in Allentown, EMS was called to a daycare center for an unconscious child, and 27 children and 3 adults were taken to the hospital because of carbon monoxide poisoning, and the daycare center had no alarm. By the way, there's none required at daycares in the state of Pennsylvania. Our construction codes require them in new buildings, and since then, there have been bills introduced to require carbon monoxide alarms in public schools, daycares, dependent care facilities, dormitories, hotels, and inns. And they did pass, dependent care facilities was passed in 2013. That is 9 years ago. The rest are in process. Senator Fontana has been introducing since then 4 bills that have been stuck in committee every single year in the same committees that Michael's been talking to you about. And daycare has been one of them. And daycare was the one the legislature was most interested in. So look at these votes. Every year, for the last 6 years, there's been a unanimous vote on the floor of the Senate to require carbon monoxide alarms in daycare. Can I just have a show of hands of how many people think this is controversial? Not a soul. Well, it was unanimous in the Senate, but a committee chair, as both Jodi and Michael have alluded to, has an awful lot of power. They can ignore any and every bill. This bill is going to the House Health Committee, which was specifically not on the list of most efficient committees that Michael just presented to you. And that particular chair has chosen to never place this on the committee agenda. In her words, the prerogative of the chair to decide what bills should come through. So a unanimous vote in the Senate 3 times over 6 years, 3 legislative sessions, is not enough to bring that to the attention of this particular committee. Which begs the question, why is it so hard to pass carbon monoxide alarm legislation? I can't tell you why she doesn't bring it on the committee. I can't tell you if she doesn't like it, if it's petty, if the speaker doesn't like it, who is against it. I'm trying to figure out who's against carbon monoxide alarms in daycare centers. They're not even expensive, it's $20. So I can't explain to you why I can't move, but I can show you that you and I as taxpayers are paying $100,000 a year for all those salaries to have this sit. That's what happened, and 6 years after this, in 2022, we're very lucky that no child was harmed in that daycare center in Allentown. You sort of hope we don't have to wait for a child's death in order to pass the bill. The second example I'm going to give you is a different one to illustrate for you. Again, these are real bills. They're not the most important issue that ever faced the state of Pennsylvania, but it makes you feel like these things we should be able to do. Who here rides a motorcycle? You don't have to own up. Somebody must ride motorcycles. Okay, everybody, a lot of people here drive cars. There's an automobile lemon law in the state of Pennsylvania that protects you as a consumer when you buy a new car. There is not a comparable law for motorcycles, which are expensive. So this is another story of how nothing gets done. There were two identical bills in 2019. This is Mark Kelly and his twin brother, the astronauts, to remind you how similar these bills were. It started in 2019. I'm going to show you a timeline, but the bills start both in the House and the Senate and are going to go through both sets of committee. And here you see at the end that nothing gets done. So I'll walk you through it. Blue is what's happening in the House. Orange is what's happening at the Senate. We have a bicameral legislature. They both have to look at it. So in January, the bill goes to committee in the House. It passes the House 168-6, pretty strong passage, and then is sent to the Senate committee, right? Because it has to go to the Senate. In the meantime, in July, the Senate gets its own bill, which goes to the same committee. So the committee now is sitting on two bills, one from the House that's already passed and its own bill. They do nothing in the fall, nothing in the winter, nothing in the spring. I will remind you that the spring of 2020, we did have a pandemic that might have impacted, just, to be fully fair. In October of 2020, I remind you that a session ends November 30th. Sessions are required by state constitution to end on November 30th. In October of 2020, this committee, which has now had the bills for 18 months, sends both of them out. They have amended the House bill, so it can't pass fully into law without going back to the House. They have not amended the Senate bill. And for reasons that I cannot explain to you, in November, the Senate acts on its bill, which it passes 48-0, but there's no vote on the House bill. So now in November, with less than 30 days to go, the Senate bill has to go back to that same House committee that started the whole thing in February, and it won't surprise you that nothing happened. So nothing happened in the session. Nothing got done. So what can you do? They don't vote on bills, and they don't reconcile them. And unfortunately, you're going to see the same thing just happen in these 2 years. So this time we have identical bills. Both go through January in the Senate, January in the House. Both are passing unanimously. The Senate passes its bill 48-0. The House passes its bill 201-0. They are both sent to the opposite chamber. Winter, spring, summer of 2022, nothing happens. In October, the House sends out its bill to the floor, but fundamentally by November 30th, which was 2 days ago, there's no vote in the House on the Senate bill, no vote in the Senate on the House bill. So you have a bill that has passed both chambers unanimously, and the chamber still can't organize and reconcile themselves enough to have that bill pass into law. We will have to start again in January of 2023. So as fair districts, we've been saying for a long time, bipartisan bills deserve a vote. These are examples of bills that deserve a vote. We need better rules to make it happen. So the examples that Jodi gave you or that Michael gave you, or as you can see in these bills, and they're hardly alone, are bills that would be able to move through our legislature and that our legislature could work for us, the citizens, and not be roiled in some of these sort of incredibly bureaucratic and non-functional behaviors. So we will all take questions now. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your work on rules. We'd like to see more bills pass, and I know both Jodi and Michael will be happy to take questions. So anyone, if you need to get up and stretch, totally understood. And if you'd like to take questions, if you'd like to have questions, we'll stand here and answer until people have done. Because rules are complicated. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Rich. Yep.
Rules can obviously be suspended. So then can we talk about who has the power to suspend rules? And then the corollary question is, should we since they can be easily suspended or ignored, should we be all hung up on worrying about rules that are created on the first day of a legislative session? Start with the first one, who can suspend
From my understand,
Do you know the answer?
From my understanding, and correct me if I'm saying something wrong, to suspend the rules in the House, it requires a two-third vote. To suspend the rules in the Senate, it's a simple majority. The bills that I gave you examples of where rules were broken, they did not suspend the rules. And that lies in the job of the parliamentarian. And I don't know whether an objection needs to be raised and why it wasn't raised for him to rule on it. But I think I had heard some statistic that the parliamentarian has never ruled against the majority party on whatever they want to do.
Rich, I want to make a comment on that because we've been talking about that a little bit among ourselves, both in the rules group and the three of us who have been doing this. There isn't, when you think about a rule, okay, so here's the question, who enforces it? Who enforces the rules of soccer? The referee, right? Who enforces the Super Bowl rules? The referee. Who enforces, and we need them, right? Everyone's aware of that, that you're not playing the game without them. We don't really have it's not clear to us who the referee is or how you would enforce a rule when it's broken, which is another, I can't give you more information, it's a future research topic. But they're suspended often. I think they're suspended often, the rules.
Yeah, I think they're suspended often in the Senate. I don't know so much in the House because it does require a two-thirds vote. And they made that change for that very reason, because when you go back through reading transcripts of older House session days, yeah, I do that. They're suspending the rules right and left, even within one day, so. Go ahead.
These bills, it's so embarrassing, right? Just die for no reason. Is there really an underlying reason? It's not just incompetence and inefficiency, but there is some kind of organized opposition that wants to stay below the surface because they don't want to reveal that they are in fact in opposition to those bills.
There's a lot that goes on in the caucus, along with the leaders who are looking at and stating what the priorities are for the House Republican, House Senate, and vice versa, for the Democratic Party. They are setting the agenda, and in caucus behind closed door meetings, even though we as taxpayers pay for those caucuses and they're very expensive, no one's in the room where that happens unless you're a member of that caucus.
Jodi, tell them how much it costs. Jodi's done the research on how much that caucus costs you, the taxpayer.
I think it's $250 million a year.
These are mind-boggling failures. Do we know why they object to lead poisoning testing? Or, I mean, what on earth is stopping them?
Yeah, the question is, what's stopping them with some of these bills? What's stopping the lead bill? And I can only have a conjecture, and so that's not necessarily fair. I'm an engineer, I deal with numbers. But, the insurance company certainly isn't interested in this because in the bill, they pay for that. We have certainly been down the road where parents want more control. I think it was somebody on one of our Slack conversations that said, thank goodness we already have a seatbelt rule and bicycle helmets for children, because I don't think it would have passed because of some of the extreme politics that we have on the floors.
So maybe some people here understand, but do the rules have to be voted on every legislative session?
Do the rules have to be voted on every legislative session? And the answer to that is yes, but once it's voted, and it's usually the first day, yes, it's usually the first day, but then it doesn't have to be done. As we've heard previously, there were about more than 60 in the last 5 sessions, 10 years, there were more than 60 rule change resolutions to change how legislation passes through the General Assembly, and 0 of them came out. So you can change it, but what happens is they want it the first day because they can't form committees and they can't start doing the work of the bills that, they're already introducing bills or submitting memorandum. So they can't do anything until then. But one thing they can do, and they did in 2007, was they said, we're just going to adopt last session's rules as temporary rules, and it will be good for 45 days or whatever it was. Then they actually had a committee, a bipartisan committee, that came up with rule changes and brought it back. So when you hear them say, we have to do this, we have to pass these rules, these 64 pages of House rules that you've had a couple of hours to look at, and most of those hours were while you were in session and everybody's being sworn in, it's very ceremonial. Things can be done differently.
Second part of that is, can you imagine, and I'm sure you can, as a brand new legislator, you're asked about the leaders of the party that are going to appoint you to certain committees or not, bring up a bill or not. Pass this rule from maybe the first week or second week of the legislative session, look at the pressure you're under, just pass the rule.
I can't answer that with primary knowledge, but it seems obvious that there's significant pressure. The closest vote we've ever had is 110 to 90, which was in 2019. This session, Joanne McClinton, who was a new speaker, had gotten several rules adopted for the COVID pandemic, including masking and remote voting, and she was telling Democrats to vote for them in 2021. There were 45 Democrats who did not. It was a universal Republican vote. But I want to say, Carol has been saying we're in unusual times. In 2007, the vote that Jodi was talking about happened right after the pay raise. So there's nobody in Pennsylvania who doesn't remember the middle of the night pay raise. And parenthetically, on the minimum wage, the legislatures gave themselves a cost of living raise that is tied to a consumer price index or something. So they get that automatically. They've been getting that automatically. Anyhow, that was when there was a more split legislature, and that was when they had the temporary rules. And Josh Shapiro was the Democrat, along with the Republican David Steele, who were key in that committee that reformed the rules. One of which was they could no longer take votes after 11 p.m. That was a 3 a.m. vote. Yeah.
Is there a rule or is there?
Loud.
Is there a rule or is there not a rule about unrelated amendments? So, as you know, we had Senate Bill 106, a whole bunch of unrelated amendments, and we most recently had the, I guess it's Act 108, the $1.4 billion tax giveaway to the gas industry, tacked onto an inconsequential income tax bill. So, what are the rules about whether they tack on these totally on-subject related matters?
So the question is there a rule against amending a bill to change its original intent? And yes, it was one that I did have up there. There is also a rule that says a bill should only be one subject. And so those are rules. Again, we're looking for the parliamentarian going, hey, bud, this is in black and white.
I think it's fair to say that the public is fairly aware of national legislation. And when Congress goes through its machinations with certain bills, there's a lot of press coverage. And it can inspire a certain amount of objections from the public. I'm wondering how much of this is related to there just isn't the same level of press attention, the decimation of local newspapers, etc. The public isn't really aware of all this stuff, and people can do their bait and switch, and essentially no one knows about it. I mean, you are a research team. You have to get a research team in order to put together this presentation. Whereas I think in terms of congressional legislation, a lot of people know what a lot of the back.
So the question is this happening at a state level because the media just is not covering it as much as it covers what happens in Congress and the U.S. Senate? And I will say yes, of course, especially the national outlets are much more focused on that. This is a personal comment. Spotlight PA is an organization that is providing a spotlight to our state level government, and they do an excellent job. They send out a pretty good thing every morning. I actually read it before I get out of bed because it's pretty good stuff. Also, the Capital Star is another one that provides, it's our capital that they are reporting on. So we have some, but if you've got as many people who don't know those three branches of government, they're probably not tuned into those media outlets.
We're working on that, we being all of us in this room, and for all of you who now have a link, where you can see the report. Sorry. We're working on that, and John Cromer, who spoke this morning, has taken the research to do exactly what you're talking. It's not so easy to discuss. I mean, let's be honest, we've all been learning this over several years. Every time you get to another layer of the onion, you go, you can't believe it, they amended it? They got and replaced. It's sort of hard to contemplate, actually. But that report, which we're going to distribute not just to legislatures, but to press, and, feel free, is part of our attempt, but I agree with you. It's a big issue, how we all begin to understand it. It's complicated, and that's one of the problems.
Back corner there. Yes.
Two things. Going back to this woman's question about single topic legislation. I thought it was a constitutional matter that the bill could only have one, and I'm just thinking there was a recent, I think, Commonwealth Court case where part of the legislation was struck down because the bill
Do you remember that?
than one subject. So I'm wondering if there's anyone who, part A of my question. By the way, is anyone from their districts who is monitoring court cases that go along with the research?
Well, we'd love to have you. Give me your name. We do our best. I think you've raised a question. It gets back to the enforcement question. I think probably many people in this room have noticed, particularly the abortion tag on made a lot of people think about the single topic. That bill, that constitutional amendment had 5, and I think some of them are subject to constitutional challenge. I don't know the state constitution well enough to confirm for you that it says, but it wouldn't surprise me, one topic. But then you get to enforcement. Someone's going to have to litigate it. It goes through the courts. And yes, we could probably use help in monitoring very specifically those kinds of court cases. That's a great idea.
And I will add to that there might be a difference between amending or subjects in a bill and subjects in a resolution, or in the case of a constitutional amendment, it's actually a joint resolution. Yeah. And so while there are multiple topics there in that joint resolution, they will be individual questions on the ballot. But I think there's a difference between a joint resolution and a normal bill.
The second part of this gentleman's thing and your thing about Capital Star and Spotlight PA, I think it might be helpful to compile these types of really independent journalist outlets. So there's Spotlight PA, there's also PA Spotlight. I know the two are confusing. There's Capital Star, there's Vote In, Vote Eat. I think that's right, Vote Eat. And then there's the caucus. So some of them are interrelated, but those are the 5 that I get in my email box, but you have to sign up for them. But it may be helpful for people who are interested to have at least those 5.
Sure, and that's a great list, and I will tell you that Fair Districts has a media list, and we are in contact with those people. I personally have sent emails to Stephen Caruso and to Katie Myers and a number of others, and I know that Carol and the others are very much in contact with them. So when we are doing the research and we find these things out, we are feeding it to them. Sir.
Hi. I thought Michael's list of best practices was a good list. It seemed made a lot of sense.
Get up here, Mike.
Why don't we add that to our mission to make those things happen too?
I think the kind of initial answer is like baby steps. If we're this bad, it's going to take us a little while to get. I don't think there's going to be one day where they're like, let's adopt all of these best practices. Most other states don't have all of those best practices in place. It's like one state has this, one state has this rule. And that's why Fair Districts is focusing on the bipartisan bills deserve a vote. However they get there is good enough for us. These are some suggestions. But I think proposing like all of those reforms is overwhelming and makes it less likely that it'll actually be accomplished. So I think starting off with the clear message of let's just make sure if a bill has bipartisan support, it can move somewhere, rather than kind of trying to overturn the whole status quo at once.
Just a question for you guys. We're number 45 or something in terms of productivity, but there are people that are in the top 3. Are we looking at the top 3, the top 5, and see what they're doing that we're not doing?
Yes, and that's what a lot of the research has been focused on. A lot of different individuals doing research in those most productive states. So we've looked at Colorado, we've looked at Utah, Maine, and then we've looked at states that are doing better but that are similar to us. So we looked at Virginia specifically, not because it's in the top 3, but because it has a similar kind of structure, mid-Atlantic state. So yes, we are actively looking at, what examples can we use? Because it's definitely easier to start by, hey, look what they're doing. Why can't we do that here?
Maybe not so much a question, more of a comment.
Loud.
Sorry, maybe not so much a question, more of a comment. Based on your comments, Michael, as far as those proposed improvements, this might be an opportune time when the chambers are so closely lined. It's like, we may not be in power a whole lot longer, and vice versa. I mean, because obviously things will change. This might be a good time, so we aren't going to get our butts kicked when things switch again. Why don't we say, hey, here's what we think is common sense, rules for out there. One of the key rules, having an independent, parliamentarian.
Suggestion.
Yes, absolutely. And we have found in our research, specifically the state of Virginia, they had an evenly divided legislature, and that's when they got their reform done. So absolutely, yep.
I will just comment on that a little bit in that they're already not playing well together. So I practice prophylactic pessimism. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I would hope. There's also an attitude that the minority party has felt that they have been shut out of so many things for so long. Now they might just be ready to turn the table. So hopefully it's what it is, and that's what we need to keep the focus on.
I'm just wondering whether you know of concrete bills that are about to be proposed to fix Harrisburg?
So the question is, are there concrete bills right now to fix Harrisburg? We're very early in the process, so memorandum are just being submitted, and bills can be introduced but not ready to go to committee. I've looked at those briefly because those just started December 1, and I'm not seeing anything relative to rule changes.
But I think what we hear from Carol, who has good ties, I mean, this is a lot of this may happen behind closed doors, the rules, because whether they vote for permanent or temporary rules, they're going to have to put some kind of plan together for January 3rd. The Constitution allows them to set up the rules, the state constitution, and they're going to have something, or they can't move forward. So